3 a.m. The kitchen is silent. You know this silence, don't you? It is not peace. It is the sound of a recipe that refuses to come together. It is the moment you stare at the ceiling, looking at the ingredients of your life, 36 years, and realizing they don't add up to a meal. They are just separate. No career, no children, no legacy, just raw, unseasoned potential sitting on a cold counter. There's a specific type of hunger that has nothing to do with an empty stomach. It is the hunger of looking in the mirror and seeing a woman who takes up too much space, yet feels entirely empty inside. November 1948, Paris. The woman standing by the window is Julia. She is 6 feet, 2 inches tall. In a city of delicate, elegant people, she is a giant, too big to hide, yet entirely invisible. To the world outside that window, she is simply Mrs. Paul Child, a trailing spouse, a woman who exists only in the margins of her husband's diplomatic papers. She does not know that she is about to change the world. She only knows that she is bored. If you are listening to this tonight, if you feel like a rough draft that never made it to the final print, if you feel that you have arrived too late to the party of your own life and that the kitchen is already closed, then stay. Because this story is not just about cooking. It is about the violence of waiting. It is about the woman who taught America that you are not broken just because you haven't bloomed yet. You are simply marinate. But to understand the chef she became, you have to meet the woman she was. The woman who sat down for a lunch that would last a lifetime and took her very first bite of freedom. But before we get to that first bite, we must understand the hunger. To understand the light that came later, we must first sit in the darkness of the beginning. We have to talk about the container. For the first 36 years of her life, Julia McWilliams tried to squeeze herself into a container that was built for someone else. She was born in Pasadena, California, into the kind of golden cage that looks beautiful from the outside, but suffocates you from within. It was a world of country clubs and polite conversation and starched linens. A world where a woman's destiny was written before she took her first breath. You grow up, you keep your figure, you marry a banker, you play golf on Tuesdays, and you never, ever ask the question, is this all there is? But Julia was a disruption of physics. She didn't fit, literally and metaphorically. She was too tall, towering over the men she was supposed to court. Her voice was too strange, a warbling, chaotic sound that moved up and down like a broken instrument. She possessed a chaotic, volcanic energy that terrified the polite society of California. She tried to be what they wanted. God knows. She tried. She smiled until her jaw ached. She attended the parties. She wore the dresses that pinched her skin. But deep down, she felt like a fraud. A Great Dane trying to pretend it was a poodle. When the Second World War broke out, she thought she had finally found an escape. She joined the OSS, the organization that would later become the CIA. When we hear that, we imagine glamour, we imagine spycraft, we imagine danger, but the reality was a different kind of torture. She wasn't a spy. She was a clerk. She spent her war years inside small, smoke-filled rooms in Ceylon and China, surrounded by the headache-inducing clatter of typewriter keys. Clack, 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 day after day. She had the mind of a general, but she was given the work of a machine. She stamped files. She organized index cards. She watched men with half her intelligence make decisions that shaped the world. While she was asked to make the coffee. We often think that tragedy is loud. We think it sounds like a crash. But the real tragedy of a wasted life is quiet. It is the slow, comfortable suffocation of a soul that has nowhere to go. It is the fatigue of having too much fuel and no engine to burn it in. When the war ended, she married Paul Child, a sophisticated diplomat, and followed him to Paris. And that is where the silence became deafening. Paul had his work. He had his art. He had his purpose. Julia had time, endless, terrifying amounts of time. Imagine her in that first winter in Paris. She wakes up at 9. The apartment is empty. She walks the gray streets along the Seine. She looks into the windows of shops selling delicate lingerie that would never fit her body. She buys a hat she doesn't need. She goes home. She sits on the sofa. She waits for the sound of a key in the lock. She is 36. In 1948, 36 is not young. In 1948, if you are a woman of 36 without a vocation and without a family, you are considered finished. You are a biological dead end. She wasn't depressed in the clinical sense. It was something worse. She was hollow. She was a massive vessel of potential, floating in the middle of the ocean, without a compass, without a map, and without a single drop of wind in her sails. And then, it happened. It wasn't a lightning strike. It was a lunch. Rouen. November. The air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and river water. She stepped into a restaurant called La Couronne, the Crown. It was warm inside. It smelled of roasting meat and old wine. She sat down. She ordered the sole meunière. It sounds so simple. Pan-fried fish, butter, lemon, parsley. But when the waiter placed the plate in front of her, something in the universe shifted. She watched the steam rise. She smelled the nuttiness of the browned butter, that specific, intoxicating scent of beurre noisette. She picked up her fork. She lifted a piece of the white flesh to her mouth. And the world stopped. It was an explosion. It wasn't just food. It was clarity. For the first time in 36 years, the noise in her head went silent. The anxiety of being too tall, or too loud, or too much vanished. All that remained was the taste, the perfect balance of the fat, the acid of the lemon, the freshness of the sea. She described it later as a spiritual experience. She called it the absolute pitch of taste. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't empty. She was just hungry. And she wasn't hungry for food. She was hungry for mastery. Most people would have just enjoyed the meal and gone home. Julia went home and bought a hatchet. She decided she didn't just want to eat French food. She wanted to conquer it. She enrolled in Le Cordon Bleu. But she didn't join the Housewife class to learn how to make sponge cake. She demanded to be placed in the professional course, the restaurateur's class. Imagine the scene. A basement kitchen, no windows, the air thick with the smell of reducing stock and unwashed aprons. 11 men, soldiers, tough, silent, working-class men who were learning a trade to survive. And Julia, the giant American woman, towering over them, unable to speak the language, clutching a knife she didn't know how to hold. The directress of the school, Madame Brassard, hated her. She looked at Julia and saw a joke. She saw a bored housewife playing tourist. She expected Julia to quit in a week, and truthfully, Julia should have quit. She was terrible. She was messy. She was slow. She burned things. She would come home to Paul in the evenings, smelling of onions and stale grease. Her large hands covered in burns and blisters, and she would collapse. She cried, not the polite tears of a debutante, but the ugly, heaving sobs of a woman who realizes how far behind she really is. But the next morning, she went back. She bought crates of onions and brought them to her apartment. She stood in her tiny kitchen and chopped, and chopped, and chopped, until she couldn't see through the tears, until her wrist felt like it was going to snap. She wasn't trying to chop onions. She was trying to chop away the person she used to be. She realized something profound in that basement. The kitchen is the only place where your background doesn't matter. The fire doesn't care who your father was. The soufflé doesn't care if you are rich or poor. It only cares if you do the work. And for the first time in her life, Julia was doing the work. But falling in love is the easy part. Staying in love when the winter comes. That is the price of admission. We love the montage in movies where the hero works hard for 2 minutes of screen time and then becomes a master. But real life has no montage. Real life has the decade of silence. After Paris, the excitement faded, the reality set in. Julia decided to write a book. She wanted to translate this magic she had found for the women back in America. She thought it would take 2 years. It took 10 years. Let yourself feel the weight of that number. 10 years of sitting in cold apartments in Marseille, in Germany, in Norway, and finally in Cambridge, Massachusetts. 10 years of typing on a manual typewriter until her fingers bled. 10 years of obscurity. Nobody knew who she was. Nobody was waiting for this book. She and her 2 friends, Simca and Louisette, were trying to do something that had never been done. They were trying to scientificize art. They fought. They argued over the molecular structure of mayonnaise. They wrote thousands of pages. They tested recipes until they were sick of eating. And then, the winter of 1959. Julia was 47 years old. They had finally finished the manuscript. It was a monster. 700 pages of dense, complex instructions. They sent it to Houghton Mifflin, a prestigious publisher in Boston. Julia waited. She had pinned all her hopes, all her validation, on this stack of paper. The letter came back. It was a rejection. But it wasn't a polite no. It was a devastating dismissal. The editor wrote that the book was unpublishable. It is too long, they said. It is too complicated. It is too pedantic. No American housewife will ever want to cook this. It is too much work. Imagine standing in your hallway, holding that letter. The gray light of a Boston winter coming through the window. You are 47. You have no job. You have no children. And now, the one thing you have poured your soul into for a decade has just been called worthless. The voice in your head, the one you thought you killed in Paris, comes back. It whispers, I told you. You are just a hobbyist. You are just Mrs. Child playing pretend. You have wasted your life. This is the cognitive cliff. This is the moment where 99% of people walk away. They look at the evidence. The evidence says failure. The evidence says give up. And logic tells you to listen to the evidence. But Julia did not listen to logic. She did something that makes no sense to a rational mind. She put the letter down. She wiped her face. And she walked back into the kitchen. She did not burn the manuscript. She did not scream. She felt the sting, certainly. It burned like a hand pressed against a hot stove. But then, she did something quiet, something that defines the difference between an amateur and a professional. She went back to the work. This is the part of the story that history books usually summarize in one sentence. She revised the book and found another publisher. But we must not summarize it. We must look at it. Because this is the invisible work. Julia looked at her 700 pages, her life's work, and she admitted that the critics might be right. It was too dense. It was too French. She realized that she wasn't writing for chefs in Paris. She was writing for the woman in a small apartment in Iowa who had never seen a shallot in her life. So, she started over. She didn't dumb it down. She translated it. She went to American supermarkets. She bought the cheap, pale, factory-farmed chickens that were available in the 1950s. She cooked them again and again, adjusting the temperature, adjusting the time, to make sure the magic would still work for that chicken in that oven. She beat egg whites 20 times in a row, searching for the exact English words to describe the rhythm of the whisk. She wasn't trying to be famous. She was trying to be useful. If you are listening to this, if you are in the middle of your own invisible work right now, if you are laboring in the dark on a project that nobody understands, and the only feedback you get is silence, just exhale. You do not have to carry that weight alone. Julia is proof that rejection is not a stop sign. It is a filter. It filters out those who want the glory from those who love the craft. You are not failing. You are not falling behind. You are simply marinating. You are letting the flavors deepen. And then, the break came. Not with a bang, but with a whisper. A young editor named Judith Jones found the rejected manuscript in a pile. She took it home. She cooked the boeuf bourguignon, and she fell in love. In 1961, Mastering the Art of French Cooking was finally published. Julia was 49 years old. She wasn't a young prodigy. She was a middle-aged woman with a bad back, a strange voice, and a book as heavy as a brick. And that is exactly why she won. But the book was just the paper. The fire was the woman herself. To promote the book, she was invited onto a small educational TV channel in Boston, WGBH. It was a boring book review show. Julia arrived with a hot plate, a whisk, and a carton of eggs. She decided to make an omelet, live, on air, and this is the moment the culture shifted. Not because she was perfect, but because she was human. The hot plate was slow. The eggs were messy. She gasped for breath as she beat them, her chest heaving, sweat shining on her forehead. She looked into the camera, not with the polished, fake smile of a TV host, but with the honest, frantic face of a woman who is actually cooking dinner. And in a later episode, when she flipped a potato pancake and it spilled all over the stovetop, she didn't cut the feed. She didn't apologize. She looked right at you, raised an eyebrow, and said, "If you are alone in the kitchen, who is going to see?" Then she picked it up, put it back in the pan, and kept going. In that moment, she gave America something more nourishing than food. She gave us permission to be messy, permission to be loud, permission to be wrong. In a world that demanded women be perfect, perfect hair, perfect homes, perfect children, Julia Child was a revolution of imperfection. She taught us that a mistake isn't the end of dinner. It is just part of the cooking. She started at 36. She succeeded at 50. She worked until she was 90. She proved that there is no deadline on your potential. The hunger you feel, that feeling of being lost or behind, that is not the end. That is just the mise en place. That is just the preparation. The screen goes dark now. We hear the sound of a match being struck. A single burner on a gas stove flickers to life. A blue, steady flame in the darkness. The kitchen is quiet. The work isn't finished, but the light is still on. Bon appétit.